The Desert Fox stood at the edge of his command post, binoculars pressed against his weathered face, watching something that should have been impossible. His Afrika Korps, the most feared fighting force in North Africa, the unstoppable machine that had rolled through every defense from Tripoli to the Egyptian border, was retreating. Not withdrawing. Not repositioning. Retreating. And the men forcing them back weren't the British regulars he'd grown accustomed to outmaneuvering. They were Australians. And they fought like nothing he'd ever encountered in 2 world wars. April 1941. The fortress city of Tobruk sat on the Libyan coast like a clenched fist, defying everything Rommel had built his reputation on. Speed. Audacity. The lightning strike that shattered enemy morale before the first shot was fired. But inside those fortifications, Lieutenant General Leslie Morshead had transformed 30,000 men into something the Germans would come to call the rats of Tobruk. And Rommel, the master of desert warfare, was about to learn that some rats bite back with the fury of lions. The heat of the North African sun beat down mercilessly as Rommel paced his command tent. His officers stood rigid, waiting for the explosion they knew was coming. 3 divisions. 3 of his finest divisions had just been thrown back from the Tobruk perimeter with casualties that made his stomach turn. The 5th Light Division, veterans of Poland and France, had broken against Australian defensive lines like waves against granite cliffs. But this wasn't about numbers. Rommel had faced worse odds. This was about something he couldn't quite name, something that gnawed at the edges of his tactical mind. The Australians didn't fight like Europeans. They didn't follow the rules of engagement he'd studied at military academies. They were improvisers, innovators, and utterly, terrifyingly unpredictable. His intelligence officer cleared his throat nervously before speaking. The British have withdrawn most of their experienced commanders from Tobruk. The defense is now primarily Australian 9th Division under Morshead. Rommel's eyes narrowed. Tell me about this Morshead. The officer flipped through papers with trembling hands. Leslie James Morshead. Veteran of Gallipoli. Commanded Australian forces in the Battle of France. The men call him Ming the Merciless because of his strict discipline. Rommel allowed himself a thin smile. Discipline. That was something he understood. Discipline won wars. But what he didn't understand yet was that Morshed's discipline was different from the Prussian rigidity that defined the Wehrmacht. Morshead had forged his men into independent thinkers who could execute complex operations without constant orders. Every Australian soldier in Tobruk was a potential commander, trained to take initiative when communications broke down, to adapt when plans collapsed, to fight when retreat seemed the only option. The siege had begun on April 10th, and Rommel had been certain it would last days, maybe a week at most. His panzers had swept through Cyrenaica in a campaign so rapid that even Hitler was surprised. The British were in disarray. The path to Egypt seemed clear. Tobruk was just an inconvenient obstacle to be crushed under his treads and forgotten. But April turned to May and Tobruk remained defiant. More than defiant. Aggressive. The first night raids caught the Germans completely off guard. Australian commandos, moving through the darkness like ghosts, infiltrated German positions with a silence that seemed impossible. These weren't probing attacks. These were surgical strikes designed to kill officers, destroy communication lines, and vanish before reinforcements arrived. Rommel's men began to dread the night, jumping at shadows, firing at sounds that might be wind or might be death approaching with a knife. One German officer, captured during a failed assault, was brought before Morshead for interrogation. The young lieutenant's eyes were wide with something approaching awe mixed with terror. Your men, he said in broken English, they don't fight like soldiers. They fight like they're hunting. Morshed's weathered face creased into something that might have been a smile. We're Australians, mate. We invented hunting. And it was true. Many of the men in the 9th Division came from the Australian outback, places where survival meant reading tracks in red dust, where missing a shot meant your family went hungry, where the land itself tried to kill you every day. They brought those skills to North Africa and turned the desert into their hunting ground. German soldiers who'd survived the Russian winter and the French campaign found themselves unnerved by men who could navigate by stars, who could smell water from miles away, who could disappear into terrain that offered no cover. Rommel tried everything in his tactical playbook. He attempted to starve them out, but British naval convoys kept slipping through, bringing supplies under cover of darkness. He tried massive artillery barrages, but the Australians had dug their positions so deep and so cunningly that shells exploded harmlessly above their heads. He tried panzer assaults, but Morshead had positioned his anti-tank guns with such precision that German armor found itself channeled into kill zones where every approach meant death. The Easter battle on April 13th and 14th was supposed to break the siege. Rommel committed his best troops, his most experienced commanders and his precious armor reserves. The 5th Light Division would punch through the southwestern perimeter while Italian infantry pinned down the defenders elsewhere. It was a classic Rommel maneuver, the kind that had worked flawlessly in France. But Tobruk wasn't France and the Australians weren't French. As German infantry advanced across open ground, they encountered something unexpected. Silence. No defensive fire. No artillery. Just the desert wind and the sound of their own boots on sand. Officers began to sense the trap, but momentum carried them forward. Then the ground itself seemed to erupt. Australian positions they believed destroyed or abandoned suddenly came alive with withering machine gun fire. Anti-tank guns that had remained silent through the preliminary barrage now opened up at point-blank range. German panzers, exposed in terrain they thought was safe, began exploding like fireworks. But the real nightmare began when the Australians counterattacked. This wasn't the careful, methodical advance of British regulars. This was fury given form. Australian infantry charged with bayonets fixed, screaming battle cries that echoed across the desert. They moved through German positions like a wildfire, clearing bunkers with grenades and knives, taking no ground slowly, accepting casualties that would have broken most units. German soldiers who'd fought across Europe found themselves in hand-to-hand combat with men who seemed to feel no fear. Rommel watched through his field glasses as his attack dissolved into chaos. Companies that had fought together for years simply broke and ran. Officers he trusted implicitly were calling for retreat. His panzers, the backbone of his entire strategy, were burning across the battlefield. And through it all he could see the Australian flag still flying over Tobruk, defiant as ever. That night, alone in his tent, Rommel did something he rarely allowed himself. He doubted. Not his tactics or his strategy. Those were sound. He doubted whether any amount of tactics or strategy could overcome the sheer bloody-minded determination of the force defending Tobruk. He pulled out his journal and wrote words that would later shock historians who'd built their careers on the myth of Rommel's invincibility. The Australians are extraordinarily tough fighters. The German soldier has come to fear them. Fear. That word carried weight coming from Rommel. His Afrika Korps had earned a reputation for fearlessness that bordered on the supernatural. They'd advanced when logic said retreat. They'd attacked when caution demanded defense. They were the elite of the elite, and now they feared the rats of Tobruk. Morshead, for his part, showed no mercy and offered no quarter. He understood something fundamental about desert warfare that Rommel had somehow missed. The desert didn't belong to the bold or the brave or the tactically brilliant. The desert belonged to those who could endure. And endurance was written into every Australian soldier's DNA. These were men whose grandparents had colonized one of the harshest continents on Earth. They'd grown up in a land where everything from the spiders to the weather tried to kill you. The North African desert was just another Tuesday. But Morshead added his own touch to their natural resilience. He'd studied Rommel's tactics obsessively, reading every intelligence report, analyzing every battle the Desert Fox had fought. He understood that Rommel's genius lay in speed and unpredictability. So Morshead made Tobruk the one place where speed didn't matter. The one place where Rommel's brilliance couldn't find purchase. He turned the fortress into a quagmire that swallowed German momentum and spat out wreckage. The defensive lines around Tobruk weren't just trenches and barbed wire. They were a masterpiece of military engineering, designed not by British experts but by Australian practical thinking. Every position had multiple fallback points. Every gun had interlocking fields of fire. Every sector could support every other sector. And most importantly, every position was designed to encourage German attacks into predetermined kill zones. German intelligence officers tore their hair out trying to map the defenses. Just when they thought they'd identified a weak point, an assault would reveal it was actually the strongest part of the line. Gaps that looked like opportunities turned out to be death traps. Positions that appeared lightly defended would suddenly unleash devastating firepower. Morshead had turned military defense into an art form, and his canvas was painted with German blood. The psychological impact on the Afrika Korps was devastating. These were soldiers who'd conquered France in 6 weeks. They'd driven British forces back hundreds of miles. They were supposed to be unstoppable. But every night, Australian raiders would infiltrate their lines. Every day, attempts to probe Tobruk's defenses would end in failure. The invincible Wehrmacht was being humiliated by colonials who many German officers had dismissed as barely civilized. Rommel's frustration grew with each failed assault. He committed the 15th Panzer Division, fresh troops with full equipment. They fared no better than their predecessors. He tried naval bombardment, aerial assault, even chemical warfare threats. Nothing worked. Morshead had prepared for everything, and his men executed his plans with a precision that would have impressed Prussian drill sergeants. But the siege wasn't without cost for the defenders. Supplies ran low. Water was rationed to amounts that barely sustained life. The constant shelling took a psychological toll even on the toughest soldiers. Men lived underground for months, emerging only to fight or conduct raids. Disease spread through the cramped quarters. The wounded had limited medical care. And yet morale remained high. Because every Australian soldier in Tobruk understood they were doing something historic. They were beating the unbeatable. They were proving that courage and determination could overcome superior numbers and equipment. The bond between Morshead and his men grew stronger with each passing week. He didn't command from safety behind the lines. He was in the trenches, sharing the danger, eating the same meager rations, breathing the same dust. When he gave an order, men obeyed not because of rank but because they trusted him completely. He'd earned their respect in a way that no amount of medals or promotions could achieve. German prisoners interrogated during the siege spoke with a mixture of respect and bewilderment about their opponents. One captured officer described an Australian sergeant who'd single-handedly held a position against an entire platoon, killing 6 Germans before finally being wounded. Another told of watching Australians repair damaged defenses under heavy artillery fire, working methodically as if shells weren't exploding around them. These weren't the stories of desperate men fighting hopelessly. These were accounts of warriors who believed absolutely in their eventual victory. Rommel tried changing tactics. If he couldn't take Tobruk by force, he'd isolate it. He pushed east toward Egypt, attempting to make the fortress irrelevant by conquering everything around it. But British command refused to let Tobruk fall. More supplies came in. More reinforcements. And critically, the fortress continued to tie down German resources that Rommel desperately needed elsewhere. The May offensive was Rommel's last major attempt to crush Tobruk through direct assault. He assembled the largest force yet committed to the siege. Artillery pounded Australian positions for days. Luftwaffe bombers turned the sky black with their numbers. And when the infantry and armor finally advanced, they did so with every expectation of breakthrough. The Australians let them come. Morshed's orders were clear. Let them commit. Let them believe they're winning. Then close the trap. German forces penetrated the outer defenses, and for a few hours, it seemed victory was finally within reach. Officers radioed back success. Maps were updated showing German gains. And then the counterattack began. Australian reserves, held back specifically for this moment, struck the German flanks with devastating effect. Artillery that had remained silent throughout the bombardment now opened up, catching German forces in the open. Infantry charged from positions the Germans thought were abandoned. And once again the unstoppable Afrika Korps was stopped. Not just stopped, mauled. Thrown back with casualties that made the previous failures look like minor setbacks. Rommel's chief of staff found him that night staring at casualty reports, his face a mask of controlled fury. We cannot take Tobruk with current forces. The Australian defense is too strong. We need either massive reinforcements or to abandon the siege entirely. Rommel crumpled the papers in his fist. I have never abandoned an objective. I will not start with a fortress defended by colonials. But even as he said the words, he knew they rang hollow. These weren't just colonials. These were some of the finest soldiers he'd ever faced. The siege ground on through summer. German soldiers began calling Tobruk the hell of the Mediterranean. Not because of the conditions, though those were terrible. Not because of the danger, though death was everywhere. But because it represented something worse than physical hardship. It represented failure. Every day Tobruk held out was another day the myth of German invincibility cracked a little more. Australian raiders became increasingly bold. They didn't just infiltrate German lines anymore. They attacked supply depots miles behind the front. They ambushed patrols in broad daylight. They captured German officers from their own headquarters. One legendary raid saw a small Australian team penetrate so deep into German territory that they were able to steal Rommel's personal staff car. When it was returned days later, stripped of everything valuable, a note was attached. Thanks for the ride, mate. Compliments of the rats. Rommel's response was to tighten security, but that just tied down more troops in defensive positions. Men who should have been attacking were instead guarding against Australian raids. The psychological warfare was working. German soldiers no longer felt safe anywhere within 50 miles of Tobruk. They jumped at sounds. They fired at shadows. They requested transfers to other fronts where at least the enemy fought conventionally. British intelligence intercepted German communications during this period, and the transcripts revealed a military force close to psychological collapse around Tobruk. Officers reported soldiers refusing to patrol near Australian lines. Men claimed to see Australians where none existed. Sentries fired thousands of rounds at nothing because they'd heard stories about silent Australian infiltrators who could kill a man before he knew he was in danger. The rats of Tobruk had gotten into the Afrika Korps' head, and fear was more effective than any weapon. Morshead exploited this ruthlessly. He encouraged the spread of rumors about Australian capabilities. Stories of soldiers who could go days without water. Of marksmen who never missed. Of raiders who could vanish into thin air. Some stories were true. Many were exaggerated. But all of them served the same purpose: to make the Germans believe they were facing superhuman opponents. The reality was more mundane but no less impressive. Australian soldiers in Tobruk were just men. They got tired. They got scared. They made mistakes. But they had something the Germans couldn't break: a culture that valued mateship above all else. No Australian soldier would abandon his mates. No Australian unit would retreat while friendly forces were in danger. This wasn't drilled into them by strict discipline. It was part of who they were. And it made them nearly impossible to defeat. A German intelligence report from July 1941 noted something that Rommel found particularly troubling. Australian unit cohesion does not break down under casualties the way British or French units do. When leaders are killed, others immediately take command. When positions are overrun, Australians counterattack rather than withdraw. Standard tactics of creating chaos and exploiting confusion are ineffective. The report concluded with a recommendation that would have been unthinkable earlier in the war: avoid direct engagement with Australian forces when possible. Rommel read that report 3 times before finally accepting its implications. His Afrika Korps, the pride of the Wehrmacht, was being advised to avoid combat with an enemy they outnumbered and outgunned. It was humiliating. It was also accurate. Every engagement with the Tobruk defenders resulted in disproportionate German casualties. Every raid the Australians conducted succeeded beyond what should have been possible. Every defensive position held longer and stronger than military theory suggested it should. The breaking point came during Operation Battleaxe in June. This wasn't specifically about Tobruk, but rather a British attempt to relieve the siege. Rommel defeated the relief force, a victory that should have cemented his dominance of North Africa. But it didn't matter. Because Tobruk still stood. The Australians still held. And the longer they held, the more Rommel's reputation suffered. Hitler began questioning Rommel's judgment. German high command suggested he bypass Tobruk entirely and focus on Egypt. But Rommel's pride wouldn't allow it. He'd announced publicly that Tobruk would fall. He'd staked his reputation on it. And now that same reputation was being dismantled by men he'd initially dismissed as inferior soldiers. What Rommel didn't fully understand was that he was fighting more than just well-trained infantry. He was fighting an entire national identity. Australia in 1941 was a young nation still defining itself. The defense of Tobruk became a symbol of Australian toughness, independence, and refusal to bow to tyranny. Every soldier in that fortress knew they were writing history. They knew people back home were following their story. They knew they represented something larger than themselves. And that knowledge made them unbreakable. Morshead leveraged this brilliantly. He regularly reminded his men of their importance, not through speeches but through actions. He made sure they knew about the global attention focused on Tobruk. He shared news reports from Australian papers celebrating their defense. He read them letters from home praising their courage. And he made sure they understood that every day they held out was a day the British could regroup, rearm, and eventually counterattack. The Australian soldiers responded with increased determination. Raids became more frequent. Defenses grew stronger. And morale, despite the horrific conditions, remained surprisingly high. German observers noted with confusion that Australian prisoners seemed almost cheerful. They joked with their captors. They expressed confidence that Tobruk would never fall. Their certainty was unnerving because it didn't seem like bravado. It seemed like stating obvious fact. By August, Rommel had committed so many resources to Tobruk that his entire North African campaign was suffering. He couldn't advance on Egypt while leaving 30,000 hostile troops in his rear. He couldn't withdraw without admitting defeat. And he couldn't take the fortress despite months of trying. He was stuck in a strategic nightmare of his own making, and the architect of his frustration was a hard-faced Australian general who refused to yield a single inch of sand. The psychological impact on Rommel himself was visible to those close to him. His health deteriorated. He became irritable and short with subordinates. He made increasingly risky decisions trying to salvage victory from disaster. The man who'd been celebrated across Germany as a military genius was being slowly destroyed by a siege he couldn't break and an enemy he couldn't defeat. German propaganda tried to minimize Tobruk's importance, but soldiers knew the truth. Officers who'd served in North Africa spoke in hushed tones about the Australians. Veterans warned new arrivals never to underestimate the rats. And slowly, a kind of respect developed. The Germans hated Tobruk and everything it represented, but they couldn't help admiring the men who defended it. One captured German diary, found after the war, contained an entry that captured this contradiction perfectly. We fought the Russians and they were brave. We fought the British and they were disciplined. We fought the French and they were proud. But the Australians are something else entirely. They're terrifying because they don't seem to care about dying. They care about winning. And they'll do absolutely anything to win. Morshead read intelligence reports about German morale with grim satisfaction. He wasn't cruel by nature, but he understood that breaking enemy will to fight was as important as breaking their physical forces. Every day Tobruk held was another day German soldiers woke up wondering if this would be the day Australian raiders found them. Every night was another night of fear and exhaustion. And slowly, inevitably, the besiegers were becoming more besieged than the defenders. The supply situation in Tobruk was desperate by any objective measure. Rations were cut to starvation levels. Water was so scarce that men learned to function while constantly dehydrated. Medical supplies ran critically low. And yet the defense held. Because Morshead had calculated something that Rommel hadn't. Australians were used to hardship. They'd grown up in a land where prosperity meant merely surviving. Deprivation wasn't new to them. It was normal. German soldiers, by contrast, came from a military tradition that emphasized proper logistics and supply. When those broke down, morale collapsed. The Afrika Korps was experiencing supply difficulties of its own, and the men didn't handle it well. They'd been promised quick victory and comfortable conditions. Instead, they got endless siege warfare and Australian bullets. September brought a change in command. British leadership decided to rotate the Australian 9th Division out of Tobruk and replace them with other troops. It wasn't because the Australians had failed. Quite the opposite. They'd succeeded beyond all expectations, and British command wanted to preserve these valuable forces for future operations. But the decision was controversial. Many Australians wanted to stay. They'd held Tobruk for 5 months against everything Rommel could throw at them. Leaving felt like abandoning an unfinished job. Morshead himself was torn. He understood the strategic logic of the rotation, but emotionally, Tobruk had become his fortress, his responsibility, his legacy. The withdrawal was conducted with typical Australian efficiency. Over several weeks, units rotated out under cover of darkness while fresh troops rotated in. The Germans never realized what was happening until it was complete. When Rommel's intelligence finally pieced together that the Australians were leaving, there was a sense of relief mixed with disappointment. Relief because the most dangerous enemy was departing. Disappointment because Rommel had wanted to defeat them, not watch them leave unbeaten. Before leaving, Morshead gathered his officers for a final briefing. They stood in the underground command post that had been home for so long, maps covering every surface, the smell of earth and explosives thick in the air. What we've done here matters, Morshead said quietly. Not because we held some fortress, but because we proved something about who we are. We proved Australians don't break. We proved that determination beats technology. We proved that the master of desert warfare can be defeated by men who refuse to lose. The officers nodded silently. They were exhausted, filthy, thinner than they'd been 5 months ago. But they stood straight and proud. They'd earned that pride through blood and suffering. They'd beaten the desert fox at his own game. When Rommel learned that Morshead specifically was leaving, he reportedly had a grudging respect. That man made my life hell for 5 months. He turned my greatest strength into my greatest weakness. He took speed and momentum and turned them into liabilities. The officer who reported this added that Rommel then said something even more telling. I would not want to face him again. The siege of Tobruk continued after the Australians left, but something had changed. The new defenders fought bravely, but they weren't the rats. They didn't have that same combination of toughness, innovation, and sheer bloody-minded determination. German soldiers noticed the difference immediately. The night raids became less frequent. The defensive fire less accurate. The psychological pressure less intense. Tobruk would eventually fall in June 1942, long after Morshead and his Australians had departed. And when it fell, it was to a massive German offensive with overwhelming force. But by then the strategic situation had changed. The fortress had served its purpose. It had held long enough for British forces to regroup. It had tied down German resources for over a year. And most importantly, it had shattered the myth of Wehrmacht invincibility. The defense of Tobruk became legendary in Australian military history. The rats of Tobruk became a source of national pride that persists to this day. Songs were written about them. Books chronicled their defense. Veterans of the siege were treated as heroes for the rest of their lives. And rightly so, because what they accomplished was genuinely extraordinary. But the impact on Rommel was equally significant, if less celebrated. The Desert Fox never fully recovered from Tobruk. His health continued to deteriorate. His decision-making became more erratic. The aura of invincibility that had surrounded him was broken. And while he would win other battles, he would never again have that same supreme confidence that had characterized his early North African campaigns. German military analysts after the war studied Tobruk extensively, trying to understand how such a disaster had occurred. Their conclusions were damning. Rommel had underestimated his enemy based on prejudice and assumption. He'd committed to an objective without properly analyzing the cost. He'd allowed pride to override tactical judgment. And most critically, he'd failed to adapt when his initial strategy failed. Morshed's victory at Tobruk was the result of superior preparation, better understanding of his own force's strengths, and willingness to fight the battle on his own terms rather than Rommel's. He'd studied his enemy, anticipated their moves, and prepared countermeasures. He'd maintained morale through leadership and shared hardship. And he'd never, for a single moment, believed that defeat was possible. The contrast between the two commanders was stark. Rommel was brilliant, charismatic, and bold. But he was also arrogant, impulsive, and inflexible. Morshead was methodical, unglamorous, and cautious. But he was also adaptable, perceptive, and absolutely relentless. In the crucible of Tobruk, cautious determination defeated brilliant improvisation. The legacy of Tobruk extended far beyond North Africa. Australian soldiers who survived the siege went on to fight in other campaigns, bringing with them the confidence and experience gained from beating the best the Germans could offer. They knew they could win because they'd already won against impossible odds. That psychological edge proved invaluable in subsequent battles. For German soldiers, Tobruk became a cautionary tale. New troops arriving in North Africa were warned about underestimating Commonwealth forces. Officers who'd survived the siege taught their replacements to respect the enemy, to prepare thoroughly, and to never assume victory was guaranteed. The hard lessons learned at Tobruk saved German lives in later campaigns, but they also marked the beginning of the end for Wehrmacht invincibility. The moment that perhaps best captured the entire siege came during one of the final Australian raids before the rotation. A small team penetrated deep into German lines, killed several sentries, destroyed a supply depot, and were making their escape when they encountered a German patrol. A brief firefight erupted. One Australian was wounded. His mates refused to leave him behind. The Germans, who could have easily overwhelmed the small Australian team, held their fire as the Australians carried their wounded comrade to safety. When asked later why they didn't press the attack, a German sergeant said something that revealed how much the siege had changed the Afrika Korps, because they'd have done the same for their mate. And they'd have made us pay in blood for trying to stop them. Better to let them go and live to see tomorrow. That mutual respect, born from months of brutal combat, was perhaps the strangest outcome of the siege. Germans and Australians hated each other as enemies but respected each other as soldiers. They tested each other's limits and found those limits higher than either expected. The rats of Tobruk taught the Desert Fox a lesson he never forgot. And in doing so they changed the course of World War II in North Africa. Not through one dramatic battle, but through 8 months of relentless, unbreakable defense. 8 months of proving that sometimes, the best offense is a defense so strong, so determined, so utterly uncompromising that even the greatest military minds of the era cannot crack it. That was Australia's savage revenge. Not savage in cruelty but savage in the old sense. Wild, untamed, ferocious. The Australians defended Tobruk with a ferocity that came from the land that forged them. A land where everything was harsh and unforgiving. A land where survival meant being tougher than your environment. And when they brought that Australian toughness to the North African desert, they proved that even the Desert Fox could be beaten. Rommel knew it. His officers knew it. His soldiers knew it. And eventually the whole world knew it. The rats of Tobruk had taken on the best the Wehrmacht could offer and emerged victorious. They'd earned their place in history. They'd earned Australia's eternal gratitude. And they'd earned Rommel's grudging respect, which was perhaps the highest compliment of all. Because when the greatest tactical mind of his generation acknowledges that you've beaten him, when the Desert Fox himself admits his men fear you, when the unstoppable Afrika Korps is stopped cold by your defenses, you've achieved something that transcends military victory. You've achieved legend. And that's exactly what the Rats of Tobruk became. Legends who proved that Australian courage was more than a match for German steel.